was illiterate. But what happens when all these people who know how to read choose not to? Well, classical education pioneer Lee Bortons says, quote, "In an increasingly image-based culture, the art and practice of reading are threatened. There is a difference between illiteracy, the inability to read, and alliteracy, the unwillingness to read. Alliteracy presents a far more real and present danger to our democracy than illiteracy," end quote. The practice of alliteracy is a recent phenomenon that impairs critical thinking and promotes impatience, and it has gone on long enough. Now I see 3 remedies we can employ to combat alliteracy. First, we need to read more books. Now, I know I had you at read more books, but it's a bit more than that. Second, we need to read more thick books. And finally, we need to read more old books. The average American reads only 1 book a year, so this desire to read, whether or not it exists, obviously is not strong enough to overcome the obstacles of time and convenience. Now, reading is certainly worthy of both of these resources, however, at least according to Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Teddy was quite famously a voracious reader, and he read at least 1 book every single day before breakfast, and proved through his dedication that he believed reading to be invaluable. He highlighted not only the benefits of reading, but also the dangers of not participating in bettering your mind. He says, if you could kick the person in the pants, responsible for most of your trouble, you wouldn't sit for a month. According to him, everyone should be well versed in poetry and novels, and not just self-help or science books. While those have their place, they can never truly replace the study of philosophy or the excitement of fiction. Now, Teddy particularly loved books that produced enjoyment through reading. He says, quote, "Personally, the books by which I've profited infinitely more than by any others have been those in which the profit was a byproduct of the pleasure. That is, I read the books because I enjoyed them, because I liked reading them, and the profit came in as part of the enjoyment," end quote. Reading doesn't have to be a chore. We profit infinitely more by reading books that we enjoy. However, many people feel they don't have the time necessary to read an entire book. Well, motivational speaker Zig Ziglar addresses this very valid concern that reading is difficult to find time for. He says that if the average American reader, someone who could read about 220 words in 1 minute, dedicated just 20 minutes of each day to reading a book, they could read 20 books in a year. That's 19 more books than the average person. This is an easily attainable goal, and I think it's quite worth it. Now, at this point, many people would argue, well, why is it worth it? I mean, so far I've gotten along just fine without all that much reading, so it obviously can't be that big of a deal. Well, Mr. Ziglar would disagree with you. He says that readers are generally more mature and successful in every area of life. He says, quote, "Not only does reading give them information, but it also provides inspiration and keeps them on the grow," end quote. But why does reading provide inspiration? What makes just reading such a huge advantage? Well, C.S. Lewis offers part of the answer to these questions in his book, An Experiment in Criticism. He says, quote, "We realize it best when we talk with an unliterary friend. He may be full of goodness and good sense, but he inhabits a tiny world. In it, we should be suffocated. A man who is contented to be only himself, and therefore less a self, is in prison. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself, but am never more myself than what I do," end quote. Reading books allows us to practice a different perspective than we normally would. It broadens our horizons in a way that nothing else could. It allows us to access the wisdom of past mentors. Now, not only does it give us an instant window into a great mind, but this mind also has a chance to fully develop its argument without the reader refuting it. Lee Bortons offers an extensive defense of reading in her book, The Question. She reasons, quote, "Reading trains children to give their sustained attention to an argument. This is critical thinking. Too often, our political discourse today involves emotional reactions to sound bites. Instead, we need to cultivate patient readers who are willing to listen to an argument in its entirety and then sift through the evidence, judging what is true and rejecting what is not," end quote. In today's social media-infused world, we are inclined to read tweets of 280 characters or less, the caption beneath a single picture, or occasionally, a click beyond the headline that reads, "You will never believe what happened next." We do this to optimize the time needed to consume the maximum amount of information. Now, reading an entire book, on the other hand, gives you a chance to hear the author's entire argument before you have a chance to refute it. Now this tact, for the most part, dispels the emotional or shallow arguments and gives way to opinions which are conceived only after deep meditation and a complete supply of information. In order to dispel the idea of illiteracy, we need to read thick books in their entirety, not just short articles and underdeveloped opinions. Now this complete argument is made even more valuable if read from the perspective of the person who first conjured it, or the source. Now, in order to read from the source, we must dust off an antiquated book, something that is intimidating to people who feel they are not equipped to deal with such a volume. Well, C.S. Lewis offers a compelling argument for pushing past this discomfort in an essay titled On Reading Old Books. Now, Lewis contends that one should read old books more than modern ones, and he does this through the story of a student who's told to find an understanding of Plato's philosophy. Now, such a student would normally be inclined to look for a modern dissertation on Plato's works, and would shudder at the thought of going to this source. Lewis maintains, quote, "The error is rather an amiable one, for it springs from humility. Such a student is half afraid to meet one of the great philosophers face to face, and thinks he will not understand him. But if he only knew the great man, just because of his greatness, is much more intelligible than the modern commentator. Even the simplest of students will be able to understand, if not all, in a very great deal of what Plato said. Hardly anyone can understand some modern book on Platoism. It is always, therefore, been one of my main endeavors as a teacher to persuade the young that first-hand knowledge is not only more worth acquiring than second-hand knowledge, but is usually much easier and more delightful to acquire." End quote. Reading old books unveils a different perspective that second-hand analysis simply cannot create. Now, over the past 7 minutes, you've heard a lot about the benefits of reading. Well, I want to give you a couple of examples to highlight how deeply embedded in our society the problem of illiteracy is. The fact is, our American education system is rampant with illiteracy. Let me give you an example of my aunt, who teaches English at a public school. Now, my aunt is an accomplished educator and has taught English at both grade school and high school level for the past decade. She is competent and skilled, and yet, all the way through high school, all the way through college, even all the way through getting a master's degree, she has never read a single work by William Shakespeare. Let me give you another example. I tutor this boy on Tuesdays. His name is Cameron. He's 12 years old, and until last year he went to public school. Well, until last year, he was never required to read a single book. At the classical school he's going to right now, not only is he required to read aloud in class every single day, but he's also beginning to enjoy it. This boy, who, like most middle schoolers, hated reading, now brings a book with him on every car ride. The reason? Because his teacher destroyed his tendency towards illiteracy. Ultimately, the stories I've just shared with you are quite useless, unless they are heard and then acted upon. Because it's quite easy to say, yes, that is good, solid advice, but I just don't have time for that in my life. And maybe that's true. But what if it isn't? For as often as it is said, one of the biggest lies we tell ourselves is, oh, I don't have time for that. In reality, I make time for things which I find valuable. One time when I told my dad that I didn't have time to do something, he said, "Your problem is not one of resource constraints, but of resource allocation." He's a CPA. My personal confrontation with this principle began in December of last year, when I really did want to read more, but I just couldn't find the time to do so. In order to read more, I had to change what I loved. Now, it might be a reach to say that I loved video games, but I was spending too much time playing them. And so I decided that it would be better for me and for my goals in life if I used that time instead to read. This decision has made my life notably better and honestly quite a bit more productive. I think we can all consider our resources and maybe reallocate some of them to reading. So, every once in a while, even if it's just for 20 minutes a day, pick up a book and follow in the footsteps of Theodore Roosevelt, Zig Ziglar, and C.S. Lewis. Thank you for your time today.